The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, carried by a rider who did not dismount until he was certain the gate before him belonged to the right house. He handed it to the gardener's boy without a word, turned his horse, and was gone before anyone thought to ask his name. The boy carried it inside, still damp from the morning mist, and by the time it reached the hands it was meant for, no one in the house could have guessed that a single folded page would soon undo 11 years of careful, deliberate silence. It bore no seal. Only a name, written in a hand grown unsteady with age: Miss Cora Whitfield. She was not, that morning, anyone of particular consequence. She kept the accounts of a small dressmaker's shop in the market town of Elston. 3 counties from the grand houses, whose names she had once known intimately, and further still from the fortune that had once, briefly, belonged to her family. She read the letter twice by the pale window light before she understood what it asked of her, and a third time before she allowed herself to believe it. The letter came from a solicitor acting on behalf of the Duke of Ravensmore, a man Cora had met exactly once in her life, 11 years before, on the worst day of it. Before Cora's story truly begins, if tales like this, old English estates, quiet women who are underestimated until they can no longer be ignored, are the kind of thing that keeps you up past midnight, this is your channel. Subscribe now, so the next story finds you the moment it's ready. And while Cora is still standing at that window, letter in hand, tell me in the comments below, where in the world are you watching from tonight? I read every single one. Now, back to Elston. The letter requested. No, it's summoned, in the careful, formal language solicitors reserve for matters they wish to appear routine, even when they are anything but, that Miss Whitfield present herself at Ravensmore Park within the fortnight, regarding a parcel of land bequeathed to her under the terms of a will she had never known existed. Cora had not thought of Ravensmore Park in years. Not willingly, it was the estate that bordered the modest farm her father had once owned, before debt and disgrace had taken it from him within the span of a single terrible season. She had been 14 when the Whitfield land was sold at auction to settle debts her father swore, until his dying breath, he had never truly owed. She remembered the day with a clarity that 11 years had done nothing to dull. The cart loaded with what little furniture the family had been permitted to keep, her mother's face carved from something harder than grief, and the tall, cold figure of the young Duke of Ravensmore watching from horseback as the Whitfield family left the only home Cora had ever known. She had hated him, quietly and thoroughly, for over a decade, and now his own solicitor was informing her that some forgotten corner of that very estate, a stretch of land so poor and neglected that even the Duke's own steward had long since stopped bothering to walk it, now belonged, by the terms of a will she could not begin to explain, to her. To understand why this news struck Cora with such force, one must first understand what had truly been lost on the day her family's farm was sold. The Whitfields had never been wealthy, not in the manner of the great families whose names filled the county's finer drawing rooms. But they had been proud and industrious, and, until that final terrible season, entirely their own masters, working land that had belonged to Cora's grandfather before her father, free from the obligations and humiliations that came with serving in another family's shadow. The ruin came suddenly, as ruin so often does. A series of failed harvests, blamed at the time on poor weather and worse luck, left her father unable to meet payments on a loan he had taken years before to expand the farm's boundaries. The loan, Cora would later learn, had been arranged through an agent connected, however distantly, to the Ravensmore estate, and it was the young Duke himself, newly inherited into his title, and eager to prove his authority, who had called the debt due in full rather than granting the extension every other landholder in the county would have considered ordinary courtesy. Her father had begged. Cora remembered that too, though she had been kept from the room where the begging happened, listening instead through a door left carelessly ajar, her mother's hand tight around her own. She remembered her father's voice, usually so steady, cracking as he asked for nothing more than a single season's grace. She remembered the silence that followed, and then the sound of the Duke's boots on the gravel outside, unhurried, as he left without granting it. Within 2 years, her father was dead, of illness, officially, though Cora had always privately believed grief and shame had done at least as much damage as any fever. Her mother followed not long after, worn down by a poverty she had never been raised to expect. Cora, left with a small inheritance too modest to sustain any real independence, had built a quiet, careful life for herself in Elston. The accounts of a dressmaker's shop, a small rented room above a bakery, a life measured out in careful sums that never quite added up to comfort, but never quite tipped into ruin either. She had told herself, in the years since, that she had made peace with what was lost. She understood now, reading the solicitor's letter a 4th time, that she had never made peace with anything at all. She had simply buried it deep enough that it had stopped, most days, making itself known. There had been small cruelties along the way that she rarely allowed herself to remember in detail. A position as governess, offered and then quietly withdrawn once the family in question learned whose daughter she was, as though disgrace might prove contagious to their own children. A young man in Elston who had walked out with her for the better part of a summer, attentive and warm, until his father, a modestly prosperous merchant with ambitions for his son's eventual marriage, made plain, over a dinner Cora was never invited to attend, that a Whitfield match would do the family's reputation no favours at all. She had not wept over that particular loss, not truly, though she had noticed, in the weeks after, how carefully she had begun avoiding the street where his father's shop stood. She had built her small life in Elston out of exactly this kind of careful avoidance of streets, of names, of any situation likely to require her to explain a past she had learned to discuss only in the barest, most guarded terms. It was not the life she had once imagined for herself in the years before the auction cart and the cold Duke on horseback. But it was steady, and it was hers, and she had told herself for a long time that steady was enough to ask for. She did not yet understand that the very estate which had ruined her family was about to offer her something far stranger than an apology, a chance to build, from the most worthless corner of that same land, something the Duke himself would be forced to reckon with. The carriage that carried her to Ravensmoor Park a fortnight later was hired with money she could ill afford to spend, though she told herself the solicitor's letter had made the summons impossible to refuse. She wore her best dress, grey, practical, the sort of garment that drew no attention and invited no particular judgment, and she held her hands folded tightly in her lap the entire journey, as though loosening them might allow 11 years of carefully contained anger to finally spill free. Ravensmoor Park had grown grander in her memory than it truly was, she realised as the carriage approached, or perhaps it had simply grown shabbier, in fact. The house itself remained imposing, all grey stone and tall windows, but the grounds told a different story. Fields left fallow that should have been productive, hedgerows overgrown past any reasonable neglect. A general air of a great estate slowly, quietly failing to sustain itself. She was shown into a study at the rear of the house, not the grand receiving rooms she had half expected, but a smaller, more private space, cluttered with papers and ledgers that suggested a man wrestling, personally and without much success, with matters he did not fully understand. The Duke of Ravensmoor rose as she entered. He was older than the cold young figure on horseback she remembered. The years had thinned him, and something in his bearing had softened in ways time alone did not usually account for. There was a weariness in him that reminded her, uncomfortably, of her own father in his final year. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Thank you for coming." Your solicitor's letter did not leave a great deal of room for refusal, Your Grace. Something flickered across his face, not quite apology, though close enough to it that Cora found herself, despite everything, briefly unsettled. No, he admitted. I suppose it didn't. He did not rush to explain himself, and Cora did not offer him the courtesy of pretending patience she did not feel. Instead, she waited, arms folded, while he gathered whatever words he had spent the fortnight preparing. There is a parcel of land, he said finally, at the eastern edge of the estate, bordering what was once your father's farm. It has not produced a worthwhile harvest in over a decade. The soil there was always poor, even before your family's time, and my own father let it fall entirely out of use rather than waste money improving ground that would never repay the investment. He paused. It was, by an old arrangement I did not know existed until my solicitor uncovered it among my father's private papers, meant to have been returned to your family years ago as partial settlement of the very debt that ruined you. My father never honoured it. I only recently discovered that he never intended to. Cora said nothing. She was not certain, in that moment, that she trusted her own voice. I am giving it to you now, the Duke continued, not as charity, and not, I hope you understand, as any attempt to undo what my family did to yours. That cannot be undone, but it is yours by right, 11 years late. And I would rather see it in your hands than continue pretending my father's silence was ever anything but theft. That land, Cora said finally, hasn't grown a thing in years, by your own account. What exactly am I meant to do with it? I could not say. No one has managed to coax anything worthwhile from it in longer than either of us has been alive. He met her eyes, and for the first time she saw something that might, in another man, have been shame. I am not offering you an easy inheritance, Miss Whitfield. I am offering you what should have been yours all along, and admitting, as plainly as I know how, that it comes 11 years too late to matter as much as it should. Cora studied him for a long moment, weighing 11 years of quiet fury against the strange, unexpected honesty of the man standing before her. I accept, she said finally. Not out of any particular gratitude, Your Grace, simply because it is mine, and I intend to see what can be made of it. I would expect nothing less, the Duke said, and this time something almost like respect passed across his face. The land is yours from tomorrow. I will not pretend to have any faith it can be made to yield anything worth harvesting. No one else has. She left that study with her pulse pounding, uncertain whether what she felt was triumph or simply the exhausting weight of 11 years finally, unexpectedly, being acknowledged. She did not yet know that the land itself held secrets far older than her family's ruin, secrets buried, quite literally, beneath soil everyone had long since given up trying to understand. The land, when Cora walked it for the first time the following morning, looked exactly as poor as its reputation promised. Thin, stony soil stretched across acres that had clearly not seen a plough in years, bordered by a crumbling stone wall and a small, half-collapsed cottage that had once, she was told, housed the tenant farmer who worked this ground generations before her family's time. Old Mr. Hobbs, the estate's steward, accompanied her that first day with an expression that made his opinion of the arrangement entirely clear, without requiring a single word. Poorest ground on the whole estate, he said, kicking at the dry earth with the toe of his boot. Rocky underneath, thin on top. The old Duke tried grain here once, years back, before your family's time even. Barely worth the seed. I don't know what His Grace expects you to do with it, miss, and I don't mind saying I think it a cruel sort of joke. Giving a woman ground even a farmer twice her strength couldn't manage. Perhaps, Cora said, crouching to run the dry soil through her fingers, no one has looked closely enough at what it actually needs. She spent that first week simply observing, walking the boundaries at different hours, noting where water pooled after the rare rain, where the old cottage's foundation suggested a spring might once have run beneath the ground before something had diverted or buried it. She found, in the collapsed cottage itself, tucked into a rotting cupboard no one had thought worth clearing, a small collection of papers belonging to the tenant farmer who had worked this land before it fell into disuse, notes on soil, on drainage, on a scheme for irrigation the man had apparently begun and never finished before his tenancy abruptly ended. She found something else as well, tucked behind those farming notes, a bundle of letters, tied with twine gone brittle with age, addressed not to the tenant farmer at all, but bearing her own family's name. She did not open them that first day. Her hands, when she finally lifted the bundle free of the cupboard's dust, were shaking too badly to trust with anything so fragile, and the light was already fading toward evening. But she carried them back to the small rented room she had taken in the nearby village. And she did not sleep that night, staring at the twine-bound bundle as though it might, given enough silence, simply explain itself. In the days before she finally opened the letters, Cora threw herself into the labour of the land itself, as though sufficient physical exhaustion might quiet the questions gathering in her mind. She learned, from a neighbouring tenant farmer willing to share what small kindness he could spare, the basic rhythms of soil she had never before been responsible for managing, when to test its composition, how to read the particular grey-brown poverty of ground starved of proper drainage, what small interventions might coax even modest life from earth everyone else had abandoned as hopeless. She discovered too that the old tenant farmer's notes, the ones she had found alongside the letters, contained more than passing observations. They described, in careful, methodical handwriting, a scheme for irrigation the man had clearly spent years developing and never lived to complete, a plan to redirect what he called, cryptically, the old water toward the very fields Cora now stood upon, promising yields the surrounding ground could never match if only the source could be properly restored. She had no notion, reading those notes by candlelight, what the old water might mean, or why a plan so promising had apparently been abandoned before it could ever be tested. But she copied the tenant farmer's diagrams carefully into her own notebook, sensing, without yet understanding why, that they mattered a great deal more than their age and obscurity might suggest. It was only after several such evenings of quiet, patient study that she finally found the courage to untie the twine binding her mother's letters and begin to read. What waited inside those letters was far more dangerous than poor soil or a collapsed cottage. But Cora did not yet know that. For now, there was only the bundle and the growing certainty that this worthless stretch of land held more than anyone at Ravensmoor Park had ever bothered to discover. If Cora's story is pulling you in the way it pulled me in while writing it, this is only the beginning of what's buried in that old tenant cottage. Make sure you're subscribed, because what she finds in those letters changes everything we think we understand about why her family's farm truly failed. And I still want to hear from you. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I love watching this map fill up with all of you listening from around the world. The letters, when Cora finally found the courage to open them 3 nights later, were not addressed to the tenant farmer at all, but had been placed in his keeping, for safety, she gathered from the earliest pages, by a woman whose name Cora did not immediately recognize, though the handwriting itself was achingly, unmistakably familiar. It was her mother's hand. The letters spanned several years, written not to Cora's father, but to a sister in a distant county, a correspondence Cora had never known existed, her mother having always claimed, in the rare moments she spoke of her own family at all, that she had no living relations left to write to. But here was proof otherwise, years of careful, guarded letters, each one growing more anxious than the last, describing not simply hardship, but a slow, deliberate campaign to ruin her husband's farm that her mother had apparently understood and feared long before its final collapse. The old Duke's agent came again today. One letter read, asking after debts I do not believe we truly owe. William insists it is merely business, the ordinary difficulties of a hard season, but I have begun to fear it is something else entirely, that we are being made an example of, for reasons neither of us can yet understand. A later letter, dated less than a year before the farm's final ruin, spoke more plainly still. I have learned, from a source I dare not name even to you, that the loan William took years ago was arranged not by chance but by design, that the old Duke's man sought him out deliberately, offering terms too generous to refuse, precisely because our small farm's boundary touched land the Duke wished, for reasons of his own, to eventually acquire. Cora read that final letter 3 times before she trusted herself to understand its full weight. Her father's ruin had not been misfortune, nor even simple cruelty, as she had believed for 11 years. It had been calculated, a deliberate scheme to strip her family of land the old Duke wanted for himself, disguised as an ordinary business arrangement gone unluckily wrong. And the very ground she now stood upon, this poor, neglected parcel everyone insisted could grow nothing worth harvesting, sat directly upon the boundary her mother's letters described. She did not yet understand why the old Duke had wanted this particular ground badly enough to ruin a family over it. That answer, she suspected, lay buried somewhere beneath the very soil Mr. Hobbs had so confidently declared worthless. It was, in the end, an elderly woman from the village named Mrs. Aldridge who first suggested the answer might lie literally underground. Mrs. Aldridge had lived her whole long life within sight of Ravensmoor Park, and she remembered, with the particular clarity old age sometimes grants for matters decades past, stories her own grandmother had told of the tenant cottage and its land, stories of a spring, once famous throughout the county for water so mineral-rich, it was said to improve any soil it touched, that had been deliberately dammed and buried, some time before Mrs. Aldridge's own girlhood. They called it Ravensmoor's own miracle spring. In my grandmother's day, Mrs. Aldridge said, settling into a chair by Cora's small fire, with the satisfaction of someone finally given occasion to share knowledge long unused. Fields fed by it grew twice what any other ground in the county could manage. But something happened, a dispute over the water rights, I believe, between the old Duke's grandfather and a tenant family who claimed the spring as their own by ancient right. Rather than settle it fairly, the story goes, the Duke's grandfather simply had the spring dammed and buried, so that no one, including his own estate, could benefit from it, rather than share it with a family he considered beneath such good fortune. Cora sat very still, the pieces of a puzzle she had not fully realized she was assembling finally beginning to arrange themselves into something coherent. A buried spring. Soil gone poor, not through any natural failing, but through decades of being deliberately starved of the water that had once made it remarkable. A family, perhaps her own distant ancestors, perhaps some other tenant lineage lost to time, who had once claimed rights to that very water, rights a proud and possessive Duke had preferred to bury rather than share. Do you know where precisely this spring was said to run? Mrs. Aldridge considered the question with the particular slowness of someone reaching far back into memory. Somewhere near the old tenant cottage, if my grandmother's telling is to be trusted. Though whether any of it remains after all these years, buried as it was, I couldn't say. There was another detail Mrs. Aldridge offered, almost as an afterthought, that Cora would not fully understand the significance of until weeks later. There was a nephew, too, of the old Duke's, a cousin of the present Duke's father, if the family tree is remembered rightly. Mr. Julian Rain, his name was, or something close to it. He inherited a claim to the disputed water rights, or believed he did, and made a great deal of noise about it in his younger years before the family quietly settled him elsewhere, on a smaller property 2 counties distant. I don't imagine he's thought of that spring in decades, but I dare say he'd remember the dispute well enough, should anyone think to ask him. Cora did not think, that evening, that she would ever have occasion to seek out a forgotten cousin's grievance from decades past. She would come to regret that assumption before the season was through. Cora did not sleep again that night, her mind turning over Mrs. Aldridge's story alongside her mother's letters, searching for the thread that might connect a buried spring generations old to a scheme against her own family only 11 years past. She did not yet see the full shape of it. But she understood, with growing certainty, that the poor soil everyone had dismissed as simply unlucky was not natural at all, and that whoever had buried that spring generations ago had left behind consequences that were still, quietly and invisibly, shaping the fortunes of families who had no idea what truly lay beneath their feet. The digging began the following week, though Cora told no one at Ravensmoor Park what she was truly searching for. She hired 2 men from the village, brothers, sturdy and discreet, glad of the wages and disinclined to ask more questions than the work required, and set them to clearing the old cottage's collapsed foundation, working outward in the direction Mrs. Aldridge's story suggested the buried spring might once have run. Mr. Hobbs, when he learned of the digging, arrived at the site with an expression somewhere between disapproval and genuine alarm. His Grace won't thank you for tearing up estate ground without permission, miss. Whatever the deed says is yours. The deed says the land is mine, Miss Hobbs, and I intend to do with it what I judge necessary. If His Grace objects, he is welcome to say so himself. He did not summon the Duke that day, though Cora suspected only reluctance to admit he had been outmanoeuvred by a woman half his age kept him from doing so. He watched instead, arms crossed, as the digging continued through that week and into the next, his skepticism visibly wavering each time the men reported ground grown steadily damper the deeper they worked. It was on the 9th day that one of the brothers called out, his voice carrying an excitement that brought Cora running from the cottage, where she had been sorting through the last of her mother's letters. The men had struck, several feet down, the remains of old stonework, a channel, clearly man-made, clogged with generations of silt and debris, but unmistakably built to carry water. They had found the buried spring. It took another fortnight of careful, exhausting labour to clear the channel sufficiently to test whether any flow remained. Cora spent those weeks in a state of restless anticipation she had not permitted herself to feel in longer than she could remember, torn between fear that the spring had long since run dry and a fragile, stubborn hope that refused, despite every discouragement, to fully extinguish itself. The water came on a grey morning in early spring, slowly at first, a trickle, then a steady flow, then, as the men cleared the final blockage, a rush of clear, cold water that filled the old channel for the first time in perhaps 60 years. Cora stood at the edge of the newly freed stream, with tears she did not bother to hide, understanding, in that moment, that the ground beneath her feet had not been worthless at all. It had simply been silenced. Word of the restored spring travelled faster than Cora had anticipated, and it was not long before it reached ears she had not considered at all, specifically those of Mr. Julian Rain, the very cousin Mrs. Aldridge had mentioned in passing weeks before. He arrived at Ravensmoor Park, unannounced on a warm afternoon in late spring, a thin, sharp-eyed man well into his 50s, carrying himself with the particular bitterness of someone who had spent decades rehearsing a grievance no one had ever properly addressed. "I understand," he said, once Mr. Hobbs had reluctantly directed him to the fields where Cora was overseeing the last of the irrigation work, "that a spring has been found on this land. A spring, Miss Whitfield, that my own grandfather held rights to before the old Duke saw fit to bury it rather than share its benefit with my family." Cora regarded him carefully, recognizing in his tightly controlled anger something uncomfortably close to her own, worn now for a full generation, longer than her own grief had had time to settle. "I have heard something of that history, Miss Rain. I did not know a living claimant remained." "I remain very much alive, Miss Whitfield, whatever the family has preferred to pretend these past 30 years. And I intend to see my own claim to that water properly recognized, whatever paperwork the present Duke has seen fit to hand you." It was, Cora understood immediately, a complication she had not anticipated, a second grievance, decades older than her own, now threatening to tangle itself around the very discovery that had finally begun to restore what her own family had lost. She did not dismiss him outright, though every instinct urged her towards simple refusal. Instead, she listened, over the uncomfortable hour that followed, to a story that mirrored her own family's ruin with unsettling precision. A dispute over water rights, a proud Duke unwilling to share what he considered exclusively his own, a family quietly pushed to the margins rather than granted the courtesy of a fair hearing. "I do not doubt your grievance, Miss Rain," she said finally, when he had exhausted the worst of his bitterness. "But I would remind you that the deed to this land is mine, granted specifically as settlement for my own family's ruin. Whatever claim your family once held to the water beneath it was never formally recognized, however unjustly it may have been dismissed. I am not the one who wronged you, and I have very little power to undo a wrong done to your grandfather before either of us was born." "Then perhaps," Rain said, with the particular coldness of a man who has waited too long for satisfaction to accept anything less than total victory, "we shall let the courts decide whose claim carries more weight." He left without further ceremony, and Cora spent the following weeks in genuine uncertainty as to whether her hard-won harvest might yet be undone by a legal dispute older than her own memory. It was, in the end, the Duke himself who resolved the matter, not through the courts, but through a private settlement offered directly to Rain. Acknowledging the old injustice done to his family and granting a modest annual sum in recognition of it, without disturbing the deed already granted to Cora. Rain accepted, in the end, with considerably less grace than gratitude, but he did not trouble Ravensmoor Park again. Cora understood, watching him ride away for the final time, that his bitterness would likely never fully soften. Some wounds, she had learned from her own experience, simply did not heal in any complete or satisfying way, but the settlement at least ensured her own hard-earned harvest would not be lost to a grievance she had not created and could not, on her own, have properly resolved. Before we see what that water truly means for Cora's harvest, I need to ask you again, if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment, because what happens next is the reason this story exists at all. And for those of you who've already told me where you're watching from, thank you. For anyone who hasn't yet, the comments are still open, and I truly do read every single one. The transformation of the land, once the spring's water reached it, happened faster than even Cora herself had dared to hope. She worked alongside the two brothers through that spring, directing the water through channels dug according to the old tenant farmer's abandoned irrigation notes, adapting his decades-old plans to ground that had changed, in small ways, since his time. Mrs. Aldridge's stories proved accurate in every particular. The mineral-rich water was, indeed, remarkable. Soil that had produced nothing worth harvesting for over a decade began, within a single season, to show signs of life that startled even Mr. Hobbs into grudging silence. By early summer, the fields Cora had inherited bore crops thicker and more vigorous than any other ground on the Ravensmoor estate. A fact that did not go unnoticed by the tenant farmers working the Duke's own more traditionally fertile land nearby. Whispers began to travel through the village and beyond it of Miss Whitfield's miraculous harvest, of the worthless parcel that had somehow, impossibly, outgrown everything around it. The Duke himself came to see it in July, standing at the edge of fields that had been, less than a year before, nothing but dry, stony neglect. He said very little at first, simply walking the boundary Cora had once walked with Mr. Hobbs, taking in the height of the grain, the health of the soil, the unmistakable evidence of water, where none had run in living memory. "I do not understand," he said finally, "how this was possible. Your grandfather buried the reason himself, your grace, some 60 years before either of us was born. I merely dug it back up," she told him then, carefully, watching his face for the reaction she could not quite predict, of the buried spring, of the old dispute over water rights, of her growing suspicion that her own family's ruin had been connected, however distantly, to the same pattern of possessiveness and cruelty that had once driven his grandfather to silence a spring rather than share its benefit. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, and Cora watched something complicated move across his face, not quite the guilt she might once have wished to see, but something closer to genuine, unsettled reckoning. "My mother's letters," she said finally, deciding the moment for full honesty had arrived, "describe your father's agent seeking out mine deliberately, offering a loan designed to fail. Because your family wanted this very land and could not simply take it outright without cause." She watched the colour leave his face. The confrontation that followed did not happen quickly, nor easily. The Duke did not accept, at first, that his own father had engineered so deliberate a ruin, and Cora did not press him beyond presenting what evidence she had. Her mother's letters, carefully preserved, and the physical proof of the spring itself, undeniable now that it ran freely through fields transformed by its return. It was the estate's own old records, uncovered at the Duke's insistence over the weeks that followed, that finally confirmed what Cora's mother had feared and never lived to see proven. Buried among decades of ordinary correspondence, a series of letters between the old Duke and his land agent revealed, in language too plain to argue away, a deliberate scheme: identify a smallholder whose land bordered the buried spring, arrange a loan calculated to fail during a difficult season, and acquire the land cheaply once ruin forced its sale. All while maintaining the appearance of an ordinary, unlucky business misfortune. The scheme had very nearly succeeded. Only a clerical oversight, the small parcel Cora now held having been recorded, by some accident of paperwork, as already promised to the Whitfield family as partial debt settlement before the full scheme could be executed, had kept this single stretch of ground from being swallowed entirely into the Ravensmoor estate, along with the rest of her father's farm. "My father built half this estate's later prosperity on schemes like this one," the Duke said quietly, when the full record had finally been laid before him. "I did not know." "I want you to believe that, though I understand you have no particular reason to." "I believe you did not know," Cora said. "I am considerably less certain you would have asked, had this land not proven itself too valuable to keep quietly overlooking." He did not argue the point. There was, she suspected, nothing honest he could have said in his own defence, and to his credit, he did not try. What followed was not a dramatic reckoning, but something slower and, in its own way, more meaningful. The Duke saw to it that the truth of his grandfather's and father's schemes was made known to the county's solicitors and landholders. Quietly, without spectacle, but thoroughly enough that no one who mattered could continue believing the Whitfield ruin had been simple misfortune. He offered, too, a formal settlement far beyond the value of the small parcel already returned to her, though Cora accepted only enough to properly develop the land she now understood to be rightfully, entirely her own. She did not forgive him easily, nor completely. 11 years of grief and 11 years of a lie do not dissolve simply because the truth is finally spoken. But she found, over the months that followed, that her fury had begun to soften into something more complicated. Not quite friendship, not quite peace, but a grudging respect for a man willing to dismantle his own family's carefully constructed reputation rather than continue benefiting from a lie he had not personally told, but had certainly, comfortably, inherited. There were quiet moments. Over that long summer, when the Duke would ride out to the eastern fields simply to walk the boundary, Cora had once walked alone with Mr. Hobbs, watching the grain grow taller with each visit, saying little, needing to say little. He never again referred to the land as worthless, nor did he ever quite manage a full apology for the words he had spoken so carelessly the day he first offered it to her. But Cora came to understand, in time, that his continued presence, patient, unhurried, willing to be corrected without defensiveness, was its own kind of apology, spoken in the only language a man raised to authority truly seemed to know how to speak. She did not marry him, nor did the story require her to. What she built that season was not a romance, but something she valued considerably more, a name restored, a fortune earned rather than inherited, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that no one, not a duke, not his father before him, not a bitter cousin nursing a decades-old grievance, could ever again tell her what her own two hands were capable of building from ground everyone else had abandoned as hopeless. By the following harvest, the transformation was complete. What had once been the poorest, most neglected ground on the entire Ravensmoor estate now produced yields that outstripped every other field for miles. Grain thick and golden, vegetables grown fat on mineral-rich water no one else's soil could match. Merchants came from 3 counties to buy what Cora's land produced, and the small fortune she built from that single harvest exceeded, within 2 years, anything her father's original farm had ever earned in its most prosperous season. Mr. Hobbs, who had once declared the ground not worth a farmer's effort, became, in time, one of Cora's most enthusiastic advocates, quick to remind any visitor to the estate that Miss Whitfield's harvest had outsold the Duke's own fields by a margin no one had thought possible the year before. Mrs. Aldridge lived long enough to see the spring she remembered from her grandmother's stories restored to its old renown, and she spent many contented afternoons in her final years seated at the edge of Cora's fields, watching water run where it had been silenced for 60 years, satisfied to have played her small part in bringing it back. She liked to tell visitors, in her last summers, that she had lived to see 2 things she never expected: the spring returned, and a Whitfield standing taller on that ground than any Ravensmoor had managed in a generation. Even Mr. Julian Rain, in the years that followed, was occasionally seen at the edge of the eastern fields during harvest season, watching the work from a respectful distance he never quite explained to anyone who asked. Cora did not invite him closer, nor did she turn him away. Some griefs, she had come to understand, simply needed somewhere quiet to be witnessed, even by those who could not fully share in the joy of what had finally been restored. Cora herself never forgot the letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning, nor the 11 years of quiet grief that preceded it. But she came, in time, to think of that letter not as the reopening of an old wound, but as the beginning of something her family had been owed far too long. Not charity, not apology, but simply, finally, what should have been theirs from the start. Years later, when people in the county spoke of the remarkable Whitfield harvest, they rarely remembered the poor neglected ground it had once been, or the Duke's own dismissive words about land that hadn't grown a thing in years. They remembered instead the fields themselves, golden and abundant, fed by a spring no one had believed still ran. But those who knew the fuller story, the letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning, the bundle of letters hidden in a collapsed cottage, the buried spring that had waited 60 years to be found, understood that the harvest was never truly the point. It was proof. Proof that ground declared worthless by those with power to say so was not worthless at all, merely silenced. Proof that a family's ruin, however carefully disguised as misfortune, could still be uncovered by patience and persistence enough. And proof, most of all, that the people so easily dismissed by those who wronged them are often the very ones who go on to build something those same people can no longer afford to ignore. Cora Whitfield never forgot the Duke's certainty that her land could grow nothing worth harvesting. She simply made certain, by the following autumn, that all of England knew otherwise. And that's where we leave Cora's story tonight. If you enjoyed this one, there are many more waiting for you on this channel. Old estates, buried secrets, women who were never quite as easy to dismiss as everyone assumed. Subscribe if you haven't already, so the next story finds you the moment it's ready. And before you go, one last time, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Thank you for spending this evening at Ravensmoor Park with me. I'll see you in the next one.